necessary and sufficient assumptions. Before we talk about necessary and sufficient assumption questions, we need to talk about assumptions. What are assumptions?
Unstated premise.
Oh, wow, you guys are so on the ball. Okay, yeah. They are unstated premises. So an assumption is an unstated premise. What does that mean? What is it? Yes?
It's a premise that should have been in the argument.
Okay, it's a premise that maybe should have been in the argument. That might be going a little too far, but it's a premise that's missing from the argument, right? Okay, now there are two types of assumptions. Actually, there are more than two types, but there are two types in particular that the LSAT tests for, and that is necessary assumptions and sufficient assumptions. And most people get them flipped around. So there's all sorts of problems with necessary and sufficient assumption questions. First of all, people identify necessary assumption questions as sufficient assumption questions. So we got to get that straight. And then even when people start identifying the question types correctly, they're like, oh yeah, that's a necessary assumption question, and that's a sufficient assumption question. I'm like, yes, that's right, congratulations. What do we do? And they're like, okay, well, it's a necessary assumption question, and they give me the sufficient assumption test, right? And you're like, oh gosh, like, it's confusing. Okay, so we're going to try to clear that up right now as best we can. Let's try to do this intuitively first. Okay, so a sufficient assumption. Now, remember, what makes an argument invalid? Does anyone remember that?
It's too strong, or incorporates something that's not already.
It's too strong. What's too strong?
The conclusion's either too strong or it incorporates some information.
Okay, yes, if the conclusion is too strong, if it goes beyond the evidence stated, or introduces new ideas, which is kind of the same thing, going beyond the evidence stated, then the argument as a whole is invalid, because for an argument to be valid, the conclusion has to be proven by the evidence provided, right? So whenever an argument is invalid, it means that the evidence provided is not enough. It's not sufficient. So if you think about your argument, you maybe have three premises, and these three premises together do not add up to the conclusion, right? In an invalid argument. And in all assumption questions, regardless of whether it's a necessary assumption question or a sufficient assumption question, the argument has to be invalid. In other words, there is a missing piece, otherwise they couldn't ask you for it. And so that means the argument really looks something like this. Maybe there's at least one missing piece. There could be more than one. For the sake of my drawing, I'm going to assume that they've given us three premises. There's a missing piece, a missing premise, and then a conclusion. And to get to this conclusion, to have a valid argument, we need to fill in this gap. Now, a sufficient assumption is going to do what with that gap? Completely fill it. That is the definition of sufficient. When they ask you for a sufficient assumption, they're asking you for a premise that wasn't said, that is going to completely fill in any holes there are in the argument. And once you do that, once you fill in those gaps, what's now true about that argument? It's valid. So, think about it this way. When you have an invalid argument, it's invalid because your premises are insufficient. You don't have enough premises to prove the conclusion. Right? You don't have enough evidence to prove the conclusion. When they ask you for a sufficient assumption, they're asking you for more evidence, and that evidence has to be enough to now make the argument valid. In other words, it has to be enough to prove the conclusion. So, in a sufficient assumption question, the correct answer is likely to use what kind of language? Strong language. Now, if the answer fills in the gap and does more, is that a problem? No. We don't care if they give you more than what you need. Right? If the only thing that you need to know is that Bobby likes ice cream to prove this conclusion, but they tell you Bobby likes every kind of food available, including ice cream, well, you'd know that Bobby likes ice cream. You'd also know that Bobby likes shrimp and watermelon and sardines. But it doesn't matter, because all we're doing is we're looking for an assumption that is sufficient, that will get me to the conclusion regardless if it also has extra stuff. Okay? So the answers tend to be very strong. Also, the original argument, it has to have a missing piece, right? It has to be flawed in some way. In a sufficient assumption question, how many gaps do you think there likely is?
1.
Why?
Because it has to completely fill it. So unless your answer choice, if there are 30 gaps, then your answer choice has to have 30 things to make it sufficient.
That's exactly right. Like if you have 30 gaps, the worst argument on the planet, like, oh my, we're jumping from A to D and then from D to G. But anyways, yeah, if you have 30 gaps in your argument, then for the answer to be correct or sufficient, it would have to address each one of those problems. So in general, when you're reading an argument and you say, oh yeah, this argument sucks, and then it says, which one following if true would enable the conclusion to be properly drawn, that's a sufficient assumption question, you can think to yourself, okay, there's probably only one problem here, and if I didn't see it, I can go back and find it. Because the correct answer is going to want to fix that one problem. If there are 2 problems, then the correct answer has to fix both of them. And that's harder for the test writers to do. I think I've only seen it happen once. So in the vast majority of cases, there's only one problem. All right, so one problem, one flaw, one gap. Maybe that's the way to put it. One gap. Okay, in necessary assumption questions, they're not asking you for a premise or an assumption that's sufficient or enough. They're just asking you for a premise that's necessary. So the correct answer can be very weak. It may not do much at all. It's just something that you absolutely need if you want to get to the conclusion, but it doesn't mean that it will actually get you there. So for example, what do you need to get to Mars?
Water.
You need water?
You need to drink water.
You need to drink water on the way there because it's probably going to be longer than, 3 days. Is that how much time we have without water? It's okay. Yeah, something like that, right? So you need water. So if I came up to you and I gave you, is that okay? Is that water?
Yep.
Okay, if we gave you this, you would be like, okay, I'm good to go. I'm going to be on Mars now. Also, law school is over. I'm going to pursue a career in Mars. Not a lot of competition up there, so that's kind of nice, but also not a lot of demand. Anyways, yeah, so necessary assumptions often feel like they do absolutely nothing. Technically, they do strengthen the argument because they are an assumption, which means they're an unstated premise, which means they're supporting the conclusion to some degree. But they can do so little because all we're asking for is things that are necessary. A more down-to-earth example might be, what do you need to go to law school? Well, you need to create a credential assembly service account. I think it's like $180 or something like that. In addition to taking the LSAT, right? Now, if you sign up for that and do nothing else, you're not getting into law school. So it's certainly necessary, but not sufficient, right? Okay. In necessary assumption questions, therefore, the correct answer tends to be weak. Because if it's strong, it can be strong, it certainly can be. But if it is, and it goes too far, it introduces things that you don't need, all of a sudden it's wrong. Right? Like if you're like, oh yeah, to go to law school I need a credential assembly service and a Snickers bar. It's like, well, you don't need a Snickers bar, so now that answer choice is no longer necessary, and that is wrong. Also, the arguments can have many gaps. So, if you see an argument and you're like, wow, it's flawed in these 3 ways, that's totally cool in a necessary assumption question because the correct answer is probably only going to fill one of those gaps or maybe even just start to fill one of those gaps. Okay? That's necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption. I'm gonna say some questions, and you tell me whether you think it's necessary or sufficient. So, which one of the following is an assumption that the argument depends on?
Necessary.
That's a necessary assumption because it's asking you for something that the argument depends on, which is just synonymous with need. Okay. Which one of the following, if assumed, enables the conclusion to follow logically? That's sufficient. And notice the key phrase there, if assumed. It's not saying that it needs to be assumed, it's just saying that if it were. And do you guys remember what the if clause is called in an if-then statement? Sufficient condition. These are different concepts, but they're related, right? We're calling it the sufficient condition because it's enough to guarantee the then clause. That's also what's true for a sufficient assumption. It's enough to guarantee that the conclusion is true. Okay? The argument assumes which one of the following? That's a necessary assumption. If you're going to accuse somebody of assuming something, it better be a necessary assumption, or they can always say, no, I didn't have to assume that, so I'm not assuming that. The conclusion does not follow unless. Hearing both. The conclusion does not follow unless. You can't go to Mars unless. Yeah, if you say you can't go to Mars unless you have water, yeah, true. But it doesn't mean that if you have it, you're not good to go. So it's a necessary assumption. Okay? The conclusion, the main conclusion can be properly drawn if which one of the following is true? Sufficient assumption. Okay, cool. Last thing. For a necessary assumption, I'm basically asking myself which answer must be true. That's what we mean by necessary. We're saying, okay, if you're going to make this argument to me, which one of the following claims has to be true? In other words, if it's not true, it's going to destroy the conclusion. Right? If you don't have it, then the conclusion is false. All right? And then for sufficient assumption, I'm just saying which one proves the conclusion. So, if you can correctly identify which question type you're looking at, and then correctly identify what question you should be asking yourself, you're going to do a lot better on these question types. A lot of times when we're going over sufficient assumption questions and we're going over the correct answer, people are like, well, I hated that answer because it was so extreme. That doesn't have to be true. 100% right. It doesn't have to be true. We don't need that. But they're not asking you for what you need. They're asking you for what's enough. Right? So your problem stems from your misunderstanding of what they're asking for. Sometimes here too, people will pick a sufficient assumption answer because they're like, hey, this makes the conclusion true. It's like, yeah, the argument's good to go now, but that's not what they're asking for. And I think part of the confusion stems from the word necessary. The word necessary itself sounds strong, right? So if I say, hey, what do you need? You tend to think of like, oh, what do I need? What do I need? But it's not everything you need, it's anything you need. That's a big difference. Because if I ask you, what is everything that you need to go to law school? If you tell me everything that you need, what is that? That is sufficient. If you have everything that you need to get into law school, you don't need anything else to get in, what you have, that whole package right there, is a sufficient set of things, right? Because you don't need anything else. So in a necessary assumption question, they're not asking you for everything that you need. They're only asking you for anything that you need. Anything that you need. Right? Do you need that? Yes, I need that. Okay, I might need a lot more. I need a rover too. Right? I don't want to just go to Mars and just get there. Then wave. Anyways. Okay. Any other questions on any of this? Yes.
So, are these in different families of question?
They are. Glad you asked. This one
Right,
is bottom up
right,
because it's saying which one of the following answers,
Right,
if
right.
assumed, if
right,
true,
right, right.
enables the conclusion to be properly drawn.
In
So you
the same
assume
family of strengthened.
same family is strengthened.
Right.
Basically, sufficient assumption questions are strengthened questions on steroids because all you're doing is you're looking for the answer that's not only going to strengthen the conclusion, it's now going to prove it. So the correct answer in a sufficient assumption question would always be the correct answer in a strengthened question. Okay? Because in a strengthened question, you're saying which one of the following most strengthens the argument above, while the one that proves the conclusion strengthens it more than anything else. But the reverse is not necessarily true, right? In a strengthened question, you could have an answer that makes the conclusion more likely to be true but not prove it. Actually, if you want to talk about strengthened questions for a half second, strengthened questions are the in-between, right? A strengthened question or a strengthened answer is something that's going to make you feel better about the conclusion. It's going to help the conclusion, but it may not prove it. In other words, it may not be sufficient, right? It may not go far enough. But it may be more than what's necessary. Like, it's telling you things that help the conclusion, but you may not need them all. So you're like, oh, well, this isn't necessary, but it's also not sufficient. So that's the middle ground. That's the middle ground assumption. So when we first talked about this, we said, hey, there are two assumptions. Well, actually, there are multiple assumptions. There's necessary assumptions, there's sufficient assumptions, and then there are assumptions that are neither, but they're still assumptions, and they essentially help the argument because they're missing pieces of evidence. All right, this question, necessary assumption, on the other hand, is top down, because you're assuming that everything in the passage is true, including the conclusion. You're saying, if the conclusion is true, what is something that the author has to agree with? How could, if you're going to draw this conclusion, what is something that you have to accept as true? So it's a top-down question, and you're essentially asking yourself, which one of these has to be true? Okay. Yeah.
Well, we can talk later. The book, I think, is wrong. That I'm using is wrong.
Which
So,
book are you using?
Power Score. I think they're wrong about this. They say that they're both part of the prove bottom-up family. But as I started doing these questions, I sort of started to think, well, that doesn't really seem to add up. And
If that's what they're saying, yeah, it's a little confusing. Now, a necessary assumption will strengthen the conclusion
Right.
because it's a missing piece. It's something that's necessary, so knowing that it is in fact true is helpful. And because it's an assumption, it's unsaid, so it's a piece of evidence that was left out. So it is helping the conclusion, but at the end of the day, you're not looking for an answer that helps more than another answer. You're looking for an answer that's absolutely necessary. So you could have an answer, you could have a wrong answer in a necessary assumption question that is a sufficient assumption. It
Right.
helps the conclusion immensely, but because it's not necessary, it's wrong.
Is it weird to, before any of these lessons, we're using the demon, and you start to try to intuit how this works like the way that a child would, and so a lot of my ideas are being blown up by this, but the way I started to sort of think about it was in a necessary assumption question, the assumption already exists. It's in there. It's hiding behind the question text. And you have to go in there and sort of identify it, whereas you're sort of saying, is that a terrible way to think about it?
Oh,
Whereas
well,
here there's something
okay.
genuinely missing. It's an absence of something that you have to provide. Whereas that was how I sort of started to realize that maybe necessary was part of the top down, because it's there, right? It exists. It must be true. You're proving it. The Power Score calls that family the prove family, and so
Well,
that's why I started to think the necessary assumption is sort of there. It's hiding.
So here's one
You
thing to
sort
keep
of
in
bring it
mind,
out.
is that for both of these question types, you have a missing premise, right? And so when you read the conclusion, you can certainly predict, oh, here is something that was left out. How can you get to this conclusion? You must have been thinking this, or you must have been thinking that. And in a sufficient assumption question, that's almost always just one thing. And you want to identify what that is. In a necessary assumption, it could be multiple things. So you may see one or two flaws, but you also have to keep an open mind, because there may be a gap in the reasoning that you didn't spot. But as you read the answer choices, you're like, well, yeah, that's got to be true too. And so here I try to predict for both of them, but this one I'm much more open to something that comes out of left field, right?
Okay.
Whereas here, this one, and I hope we all get to this point, basically you read the argument, even if you can't predict what the assumption is before you read the question, as soon as you read the question and you realize it's a sufficient assumption question, it's like you have to make it your life mission at that point to say what is that gap, because it's just going to be one thing, it's going to be two words that are similar but different, and you're like, oh, you're assuming that this is that, right? And that's it, and it's over, and you can go find it and you can predict it, and then you can go find that answer and it's going to say exactly that. And the wrong answers are probably going to say the reverse, right? False contrapositives of what you're looking for. So, yeah, let's do some examples.